In the previous video, I said that modern discourse generally comes down to a blatant refusal to accept the truth, and it can manifest itself in four ways, through ideologies like Marxism, subjectivism, postmodernism, and empiricism, the latter of which perhaps being the most controversial. So let's go ahead and start with that, just to make people mad. Because if you aren't familiar with the actual definitions, I imagine you've heard it used as an adjective: empirical knowledge, empirical thought, empirical evidence. So by now, hopefully I've got your gears turning and you ask yourself, hey, isn't that basically the basis for modern academia? Haha, yeah. Now you understand why it's so controversial. I might as well be saying the scientific method is wrong because, well, that's basically what I'm saying. Well, not wrong though, so don't roll your eyes at me, you damned empiricist, because I have a quote from one of your gods. Science works. It is not perfect. It can be misused. It is only a tool, but it is by far the best tool we have. Carl Sagan. So this is essentially the point I'm trying to make. Empiricism has its limitations. I didn't put it on this list I've made because I think it's without truth or without purpose. It's simply that now people are using this school of thought to say things that are blatantly and provably false. These logical positivists, as we will find that they are called, will say things like you can't prove a negative, despite the overwhelming consensus that you can. They will claim that everything needs to be tested, but how do we test non-physical things like imaginary numbers and conditional statements? The answer is we can't. Empiricism is only a tool. You don't use a hammer for everything, so before we understand the limitations of empiricism, we need to understand what it is and what is our other tool for understanding: rationalism. Now, the war over rationalism versus empiricism has been heated, so the definitions themselves may even be a point of contention, but in every debate, two words pop up: a priori and a posteriori. These words refer to knowledge. A posteriori knowledge is obtained from experience. A priori knowledge is learned without experience. And before I explain what that means, I'm already gonna get flamed for pronunciation. I've only ever seen these words written down, and I swear I spent 10 minutes right now learning how to pronounce them, but there's no singular pronunciation. So don't worry about me ever saying these again, don't worry about remembering these. It's just easier to condense this terminology and not be bogged down by a dead language. Likewise, I find it easier to understand these concepts when we really try to nail them down instead of just dumping a bunch of information on you. For example, I could tell you that the statement, all bachelors are single, is a textbook example of a priori knowledge, or rational knowledge. But what does that mean? Instead, let's try this. We have reality and our statements of reality. If there exists a man in reality, we may make observations about him reflected by our statements. We may say he is tall, he is bald, and I don't know, he smells bad. These are things you or anyone else could learn by observing him physically. However, without ever seeing him, if you were to find out that he jogs every day, doesn't that imply he has legs? Or at the very least, some bipedal form of locomotion. But did I ever tell you that he had legs? Did you ever see his legs? No, you simply reasoned that he had them, because by necessity of what it means to jog, he would have to. This knowledge wasn't obtained through observation, it was obtained through rational thought. But couldn't you have just as easily gone out and looked at his legs, making that observation as a matter of empirical knowledge? So is it rational or is it empirical? Here's my unsatisfactory answer. It doesn't matter. If we ever want to complete our understanding of the world, our statements need to mirror reality. Our statements are meaningless without observations to ground them in reality. And these observations themselves are disconnected without the rationalist argumentative structure that holds them together. You cannot have physics without the math that binds it. And you cannot have math without the physical rules which it is supposed to represent and predict. There is nothing inherently wrong with empiricism. Empiricism is only a problem when we forget its place and begin to treat intuition as a pejorative. In short, people can reason things out, and empirical evidence does not have supremacy over that. After all, your interpretation of this evidence is a matter of reason. It is a matter of predicting based on your observations how something would come to be. You think everyone would understand that, but apparently not. In the 1920s, there was a philosophical movement called logical positivism. The view of this movement was that scientific knowledge was the only true knowledge, and as such, truth only held meaning upon scientific experimentation and verification, and that metaphysical statements were meaningless. Comprising this movement, its members were the Vienna Circle, a group of thinkers that I imagine probably met in Vienna. Either that or they really liked Vienna sausages. I don't know, I'm not a historian, let's just skim over the details. Basically, before them there was logical positivism. Several differing views can fall under this name. So to generalize, it was this attempt predominantly in the 19th century to take philosophy and ground it in a very scientific empiricism. But positivism had already been wrought with problems before the Vienna Circle. The implications of the more stringent interpretations of it already left at the wayside non-physical concepts like math and immaterial forces like gravity and magnetism. But still determined, the Vienna Circle sought to rectify any of these contradictions under positivism, creating logical positivism. Their idea was that positivism had failed where they'd succeed because, unlike philosophers such as Ernst Mach and Stuart Mills, whose views failed to capture logical truth and the rationalist aspects of nature, the Vienna Circle would create a system that allowed for the theoretical as well as the empirical. Well, that is, if the theoretical could be verified by the empirical. I'm trying to understand it as they understood it, to be transparent and for the sake of discussion, but it was a coping mechanism. High levels of copium. At first, positivists wanted to get rid of a lot of aspects of rationalism, but they realized they couldn't, so they're like, oh, well, let's just get rid of metaphysics. And here now is where the logical positivists still ran into problems. Maybe you could say, given their concept of verificationism, which we won't get too deep into because this video is already starting to sound like word soup, they had properly accounted for math, propositional logic, and the like. You know, math is based on physical concepts and therefore is an expression of physical observations. You can also measure the effects of gravity and magnetism very directly and very concisely. But there were other aspects of physics where their desire to throw out metaphysics ultimately would always lead to them throwing out science alongside it, which obviously was the exact opposite of what they had set out to do. To keep this simple, let's just go over one example: the atom, or more specifically, the electron. If you imagine an atom like this, which they did at the time, then we can directly observe the electrons, which is necessary for their view of verificationism. But unfortunately for them, it wasn't long until a man named Erwin Schrödinger came along, and now we believe atoms look like this, with what is called an electron cloud. And the belief here is, unlike the classical idea of an orbital, where it orbits very neatly, the cloud is more of just a probabilistic region of where the electron could be, which makes direct, meaningful observation, impossible. So like that, any hope of abandoning metaphysics while keeping physics was lost. I think this quote sums it up the best. Logical positivism is dead, or as dead as any philosophical movement ever becomes. And that last part, that stings. Because he's right, no movement ever truly dies, and thanks to the internet, despite being disproven time after time, it seems as though there's a resurgence in this movement. And frankly, resurgence may be downplaying the severity. We just went over how an entire group tried to prove that scientific knowledge was the only kind of knowledge, and how they failed miserably. But there's still this lingering feeling like I have to tiptoe around science, almost as if it's some sort of religion, because that's what it's become. If you shout at people online, telling them that they're not allowed to make rational arguments from intuition, and instead must follow the scientific method, whatever the hell that means for a non-empirical argument, then you've become nothing more than a zealot of blind faith. After all, did I miss the part where the scientific method descended from the heavens, or was it itself a man-made tool created from intuition, from reason? And take, for example, the irony of the positivists. Learn from their mistakes, because here they dedicated themselves to eradicating the belief in metaphysics, something generally derived from intuition. And why? We can dance around it all day and you can accuse me of twisting language to make a point, but simply put, they thought metaphysics was counterintuitive. And just going through that the scientific method has life because of intuition. That history has shown us if you try to remove rationalism from science, what's left crumbles in your hands. It baffles me that independent, rational thought is so under attack, that intuition is a dirty word. It isn't. Intuition is good. But despite that, it's become this sort of insult to call people armchair philosophers, or throw around labels like science deniers to anyone who isn't willing to blindly follow the talking heads, because, you know, nothing says scientific inquiry and skepticism quite like believing everything you're told. But look, kids, I'm not going to say authority is meaningless, because Carl Sagan already said that for me. Arguments from authority are worthless. Now you guys don't know what to do. He used authority to say not to follow authority. So doesn't that make him wrong? But if he's wrong, doesn't that make him right? Since then he shouldn't be following authority? Because, jokes aside, I get the sentiment behind it, following authority, that is. It'd be incredibly easy for me to sit down and say there's no need for it, as if the average man could become his own surgeon, his own engineer, his own farmer, etc., etc. What I'm getting at is that it is just as easy to ignore the limitations of authority and act as though it's something we need to bend the knee to in our quest for truth. If modern ignorance is, as I have explained in previous videos, and hopefully will further prove in subsequent videos, not just a lack of knowledge, nor a lack of understanding, but instead a blatant refusal to accept the truth, then it doesn't matter how knowledgeable someone is, or how much they've proven they understand the material, assuming our current systems of education are even actually accomplishing both of these goals. None of that matters, because you can have someone who knows that they're wrong, understands that they're wrong, but refuses to accept that they are wrong. Someone with a greater education is simply someone with more resources. And yes, that can be someone who builds a bridge to the truth more efficiently, reliably, and with greater ease, but it can also be someone who uses that knowledge to build an elaborate narrative to hide from the truth, which is ironically how positivists and empiricists feel about practitioners of metaphysics. So what I'm saying isn't controversial. Poetically, what we're experiencing is just a refusal to accept it. Because between absolute empiricism and this culture surrounding science, there seems to be a common thread of knowledge coming from a source, be it from the empirical world or from an authority figure. But how can that be the case? If you learn something and someone had to teach you that, who taught that person? And that person? Unless you believe in some sort of a-causal higher power that gave us this knowledge, which an empiricist really can't believe, then you have to accept that at some point, people taught themselves. So intuition is quite literally the basis of all human knowledge. And you can pretend that actually observation is the basis of knowledge, as if history hasn't taught us otherwise. The positivist failed. The logical positivist failed. Because what does it mean to say that observation is the basis of knowledge? Do you go around looking at atoms saying, oh, now I understand atoms? How do you even look at them? With technology, right? Technology we invented from observation or with our own thoughts. And when you see the atom's electron cloud, what observation do you make then? Here's the most frustrating thing, and this may be a bit petty, but one, I'm a very petty man. Two, hopefully this will leave no room for doubt in the relationship between reason and observation. Empiricism cannot exist without rationalism, but rationalism theoretically can exist without empiricism. Just like the thought experiment of a monkey smashing infinitely on a typewriter until it recreates the works of Shakespeare. You can randomly arrange theoretical concepts and hypothetically discover a set of statements that perfectly mirror and predict reality. And you may not think that's a good argument. You may say that without observation, our guesses are nothing more than, well, guesses. And you're absolutely right. I have a table down here in case you didn't know. If science is a tool, then it's not a hammer, a screwdriver, or even a drill. It's not something that does the action. It is something that guides the action. It's more like a level or a ruler. Observations are what make our thoughts more than meaningless statements detached from reality, yes. But science was meant to guide intuition, not supersede or replace it. Truth does not exist devoid of reason. I'm not saying that empiricists reject this fact outright, but not only in academia has there been this convoluted attempt to claim that intuition is counterintuitive, rejecting rationalism and metaphysics on that basis. But also in recent years, science has become a buzzword, because true science serves intuition. So when they say science, that's not what they mean. They're just looking for a way to say my intuition is right, your intuition is wrong, in a way that demonizes the very concept of intuition. Because if they were forced to accept that it's just their thoughts versus yours, without feigning outside intervention from authority, then they would be left defenseless against the truth.